In the winters of the Rocky Mountains, the cold gives no warning. It descends from the mountains like a hungry beast and creeps through the wooden houses, hardens the water in the buckets, extinguishes the stoves, and silences the roosters before dawn. There, everyone knows what to do. Piled firewood, embers kept alive through the night, blankets inherited and shared, a choreography repeated for generations. But in that year, 1930, one woman didn't follow the script. While her neighbors reinforced their roofs and sealed their windows, Eleanor Miller, widowed at a young age, spent her days digging her own ground, alone, in silence. She piled up stones, spread clay, and settled everything with a care that no one understood. "He's digging his own grave," some said. "He's completely lost his mind," others whispered. No one knew about the fever that almost took their son. Nobody noticed that she wasn't building a floor. She was building a last resort. And the cold was coming. In that small, forgotten community nestled in the icy curves of the Rocky Mountains, the days began before dawn. The men set off early to chop wood or tend the livestock. The women tended the fire with almost religious care, and the children walked in single file to school, huddled under worn coats and handmade caps. The houses were all alike: thick wooden walls, dirt floors, a wood-burning stove in the corner, and small, always covered windows. That uniformity was a kind of protection. Anyone who did something different attracted attention, and attracting attention there was never a good thing. That's why the figure of Eleanor Miller began to bother people even before the cold weather arrived. After her husband died in a mountain accident, she had fallen silent. She stopped going to church, refused visitors, and avoided fairs. She spent almost all her time on the small plot of land she inherited from her family, where she lived with her son, Caleb, a pale boy with sunken eyes and weak breathing. Eleanor didn't ask anything of anyone, but she didn't explain anything either. On dry October days, she began digging into the ground of her house with a short shovel, while Caleb watched, wrapped in blankets. It was a slow task, absurd in the eyes of others. Then she piled up stones brought from the river, heated in the sun and shaped with damp clay. "Does she think that stone heats up more than fire?" the butcher scoffed. "The boy will freeze to death," whispered a neighbor as she saw the boy sleeping on the newly cemented floor. The village children, who used to play with Caleb, began to avoid him. His mother was the crazy one with the rocks, and children can sense the contempt of adults. Eleanor did not answer. His hands were still dirty, his face closed off, his expression distant, as if he were listening to a different kind of music. But at night, when Caleb's eyes blinked rapidly, trying not to fall asleep, she would reach out and touch the ground, and the warmth was there, discreet, lively, persistent. She didn't know if it would work when the ice actually arrived, but I had already learned that desperation doesn't demand certainty. It demands trying. At the end of November, winter gave its first sign. A thick fog covered the valley for 3 days, and on the 4th day, the wells froze. The school stove couldn't hold heat, church services were canceled, and even the mayor, known for never going out without a thick coat, showed up wearing gloves and 2 coats. In Eleanor's house there was no fire burning. Even so, no one saw smoke coming out of the chimney. And yet, Caleb didn't cough. On the 5th day, the first child in the village developed a high fever. On the 6th day, 3 houses ran out of firewood. On the 7th day, they started knocking on her door. But that was just the beginning. It all started with a stone. The previous winter, the worst in the last decade, Eleanor woke in the middle of the night to find Caleb burning with fever. The firewood was gone. The fire had died. The cold seemed to have seeped in through the cracks in the windows and consumed the boy's body. She wrapped him in everything she had: blankets, cloths, her own body. Nothing was enough. Desperate, she ran to the small shed in the back and grabbed a large, smooth stone that they used to close the cistern. She placed it on the still smoldering embers. When it warmed up, she wrapped it in a cloth and placed it at the boy's feet. That night, Caleb survived. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The following summer, while the others celebrated the harvests and prepared the firewood stockpile, Eleanor collected stones from the river. She observed which ones retained heat the longest, which ones cracked, which ones released dust. She didn't read manuals. She didn't take notes. She learned with her fingers, with her gaze, with the memory of the faint warmth under the thick cloth on that near-death dawn. The neighbor next door, Margaret, tried to advise, "Eleanor, woman, put that boy in the sun, give him onion syrup. This stone stuff is witchcraft." Eleanor nodded in thanks and went back to digging. The ground around the house was hard. The beaten earth concealed dry roots and deep stones, but she persisted. Each hole she dug was filled with aligned stones, red clay, and a type of lime she produced herself by burning animal bones and mixing them with ash. The process took days. Her hands developed calluses upon calluses. Her arms lost fat. Her clothes became impregnated with dust. In the village, distrust was growing. Some said she was burying something, others who went mad after becoming widows. A few people thought she was trying to create a rich person's floor, something only seen in the homes of wealthy people in big cities. But the truth was much simpler. Eleanor wasn't looking for luxury. She was looking for time. I wanted a few hours of warmth that would last longer than the firewood. I wanted the kind of warmth that would sustain a feverish body until sunrise. For months she tested combinations. Stone on dry clay, stone upon hot ash, a stone placed upon extinguished coal. I poured water on top. I waited. I felt. It was work that was invisible to outsiders. But for her, each stone was a promise. By the time the last section of the floor was finished, it was already the end of October. The weather was starting to change. In the village, the jokes began. Are you going to sleep on the floor like an animal? What kind of mother throws her child onto the icy rock? She lost more than her husband. And in a way, Eleanor had lost even more. She lost her fear of looking foolish. He lost patience with other people's customs. He lost the right to make mistakes. On the last night before the cold arrived, Eleanor lit small embers on the stove for a few hours. The flames were low, calculated, not to warm the air but to warm the floor. The boy slept curled up, without coughing, without shivering. She didn't know if it would be enough, but there was nothing left to try. On the morning when the cold truly arrived, the sky was clear. It was the kind of treacherous cold that doesn't warn you with wind or rain. It simply settles in. The ground hardens. The branches crack under the weight of the frozen air, and the silence takes on a strange weight, as if every sound were afraid of breaking. In the village, everyone woke up early. The first to notice were those who had pets. The water bowls were frozen, and even the milk in the cats' bowls had turned into thick cream. The school stove wouldn't hold a fire. The children huddled together. At the baker's house, the dough didn't rise. At the telegraph office, the frozen wire snapped. The houses, which had always provided shelter, began to fail. The cold seeped through the cracks, climbed up the walls, turning sheets into thin paper. Damp blankets wouldn't dry. The firewood was starting to run out. Too fast. There was no smoke in Eleanor's house in the morning. There was no sound of crackling firewood. No sound of pots and pans. No smell of soup. Even so, Caleb played with a piece of wood, drawing on the stone floor. In thick socks, without coughing, without groaning. Eleanor watched in silence. The temperature inside the house seemed to come from below, as if the heat was in no hurry to escape. On the second night, the neighbors started talking. How come we don't hear a fire burning over there? The woman is completely delirious. I bet the boy has pneumonia. On the third day, the first child in the village developed a high fever. In the bedroom, Margaret ran out of firewood at her house. That's when she gave in. He climbed the small hill to Eleanor's house with his grandson wrapped in his arms. He knocked on the door, his knuckles red. He waited. Eleanor opened the door. She didn't say anything. She just looked at the boy. Without asking, he pulled back the blanket covering the floor, revealing the stone surface, and pointed with his chin. Lay him down here. Margaret hesitated, but the heat in the air was real, and her grandson was shivering. She laid the child down and curled up in a corner watching. The floor wasn't as hot as a pot, but it wasn't as cold as the rest of the world either. It was a quiet warmth, alive. Eleanor didn't ask for explanations, nor did she give any. The following morning, Margaret went down the hill, and the whispering began. Her floor gets hot. She doesn't even use firewood. They say the child sleeps through the night. The visits began discreetly. First, a woman with a baby, then a man with purple fingers, an old man, a mother, 2 sisters. Eleanor didn't smile, nor did she talk much. He was simply giving up the space. Limits. Organization. Never more than 3 at a time. Caleb continued playing quietly. Sometimes he would offer a piece of bread. Sometimes he would just watch. That's when the village began to split. She's hiding something. He must have buried coal underneath. That's magic. Or witchcraft. On the 5th day, a merchant tried to buy the secret. He offered flour, dried meat, and even blankets. Eleanor refused. No offense. No fear. The man left saying that it was all a hoax. That night, 3 of the oldest houses in the village suffered cracks. A child lost consciousness. An elderly man died of cold while sleeping in a chair. The next day there was no mockery. There was a queue, and Eleanor, without changing her tone, simply pointed to the edge of the house and said, "There's room for 2 here. Wait." On the night when everything was almost lost, the silence was different, thicker, deeper. It wasn't just the cold, it was the weight of so many breaths trapped in the same small space. Eleanor's house already housed 5 people besides Caleb. She had yielded to the request of a mother with 2 children, to the desperate gaze of a boy trembling uncontrollably, and to the silent plea of a pregnant woman with lips cracked from the cold. The stones still retained heat, but the method was beginning to show cracks. The heated floor wasn't a fireplace. It was a slow pulse, and each extra body drained a little of that silent reserve. Eleanor knew this, but she didn't know how to say no. That morning, Caleb coughed. A dry, short cough, but one that pierced her chest like a knife. He hadn't coughed in weeks, and now, there, among so many bodies, he was sweating profusely. She tried to disguise it. She covered him with a warm cloth, brought a pitcher of water closer and adjusted the blanket. But her gaze already said what no one dared to admit. Something was out of balance. The floor was still warm to the touch, but less so than before. The heat seemed too divided. It was fading away. The following morning, when the sun barely tinged the sky with gray, Eleanor asked 2 visitors to leave the house. With delicacy, but firmness. No accusations. No fanfare. They didn't understand. The pregnant woman protested silently. The boy hesitated, trembling, but she just pointed at Caleb, and they left. That same day, the comments spread. She chooses who gets in. She already feels like she owns the heat. He forgot that he's poor, too. A malicious murmur began to grow among those outside. The following afternoon, Eleanor went to the river to fetch more stones. She was trying to reinforce the system, to renew the heat, but someone followed her. They said nothing. They just watched, and they returned before her. When Eleanor returned, she found the door ajar. Inside, a strange smell of wet clay, of churned ash, of cracked stone. The boy was sleeping, but in the center of the ground 2 stones were out of place, as if someone had tried to pull them out, dig them up, try to understand them. She didn't scream. He didn't accuse anyone. He simply knelt down, touched the edge of the crack, and closed his eyes. That wasn't just a physical violation. It was a broken promise. That night, Eleanor lit the fire. For the first time in days, he let the heat rise through the stove and spread slowly. Then he rearranged the stones, one by one. Caleb watched quietly, but something there had changed. It wasn't just the warmth that needed to be maintained now. It was the trust. Outside, opinions were divided between those who still saw her as a salvation and those who began to call her a liar. The next day, the pregnant woman returned. She brought her husband with sunken eyes, holding an empty pot. "Just for one night, Mrs. Eleanor." She hesitated. He looked at Caleb sleeping. He looked at the ground, which seemed less warm than before. He took a deep breath, and he pointed with his chin. Just one night. But that night the heat took a while to rise, and Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Doubt. The stone floor never promised miracles. He could only promise what Eleanor instilled in him: care, order, intention. And now, it was all slipping away. The cold weather didn't let up. On the contrary, it hardened. On the 8th day of continuous winter, the community's small river stopped flowing. The sound of the water, which had always flowed through the valley like a background whisper, disappeared. A thick silence hung over the place, an icy emptiness that seemed to swallow even thoughts. The houses were on the verge of collapse. Makeshift greenhouses failed to retain heat. Rags on the windows tore in the wind. Wood-burning stoves became traps. They consumed fuel too quickly and left a trail of smoke that attracted hungry animals. A wild dog broke into a couple's house. A frozen rat was found inside a cupboard. People began leaving their homes and wandering through the community in search of any sign of real shelter. That's when Eleanor's house stopped being a secret. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, loud knocks on the door. 2 more families, 4 people in total. One of them was coughing up blood. Eleanor hesitated. The ground still held warmth, but it was different now. Slower, weaker, as if the clay itself began to doubt. Still, she opened it. He made space. He adjusted the cloths. He gave away what little he had. At night, someone tried to force their way in. They didn't hit. They pushed. The locks held, but the dry crack of the wood splitting was heard by everyone inside. Caleb woke up startled. The others remained silent. Eleanor stood up, picked up the shovel leaning against the wall, not to attack, but as one who holds a boundary. The noise stopped, but the fear remained. For the first time, the shelter seemed fragile. In the following days, men from outside the area appeared, people no one knew well, merchants, strangers. They said they had heard of the ground that never cools down. They offered money, tools, even a horse. Tell me how you did it. Show the mixture. Write it down on a piece of paper. Eleanor refused without raising her voice, not always with words, sometimes just with a look. They started calling her selfish. A woman whose granddaughter had died of pneumonia said in front of everyone, "If I had divided it sooner, maybe she would still be alive." Eleanor lowered her eyes. He didn't answer. I knew it might be true, but she also knew that if she had opened the door sooner, maybe Caleb wouldn't be there anymore. On the 12th day, tragedy struck the community. The school roof collapsed under the weight of the ice. There were 4 people sheltering inside. 2 died instantly. The other 2 were taken to Eleanor's house purely on instinct. It was the only place that still seemed to have any chance. She received them, even knowing that the ground couldn't hold much more. The house now housed 9 people. The heat came from below, but also from the constant care, discreet embers, wet cloths, freshly applied lime, an almost mystical cycle of silent maintenance. It was then that one of the men, an engineer from the capital, offered something different. "I don't want to buy. I want to understand. If it's true, it could save hundreds. Share this. You will be remembered." Eleanor looked at Caleb. He slept curled up, as always. But he was breathing deeply, without coughing. She thought, for long minutes. Then he replied, "What's heating up here? It's not just the floor. That's the reason." The man frowned. "Reason?" She knelt down. He touched one of the stones. His hands were thinner now, but still firm. Each of these stones was placed with fear, with haste, with hope. I didn't repeat the formula. I repeated promises. The man didn't understand, or perhaps I understood more than I wanted to. That night, the community fell silent. No one tried to force their way in, nobody hit anyone, but everyone noticed. They knew something bigger was happening there, something that couldn't be replicated with cement and by hand. The next day, the sun appeared for the first time in almost 2 weeks, and with him, Eleanor's floor was still warm. The thaw didn't happen all at once. He was discreet. The kind of change you only notice in the little things. A slow drip in the corner of the house, the sound of the river starting to flow again at dawn, the smell of clay waking up under the weak morning sun. But it was enough to make people start leaving their homes more often. First, to assess the damage, then I'll comment later. Finally, just a reminder. And that's when the voices changed. Those who had mocked the stone floor began to ask questions. But now, with a different tone. "Eleanor, what if I wanted to try one of those? There. Do you think if I bring the stones you can show me the way? I swear I'll help. I just want my little girl to sleep without coughing." She didn't answer right away. I was expecting it. I observed the face, the body, the weight of the request. She took some in. Others he simply listened in silence. That's when a delegation came from the big city. A man in a suit, 2 engineers, and a photographer. They wanted to understand, to document, to replicate. They arrived with papers, instruments, and even promised a commemorative plaque. Eleanor did not stop them from entering, but he didn't guide them either. I simply said, "Look, but don't move anything." The photographer took some pictures. The engineers took notes. The city man tried to explain that with investment this could become a national project. Houses with natural heating, economy, innovation. She simply said, "This didn't come from study. It was born from a fever that I couldn't repeat." They didn't know what to do with that sentence. She wasn't suitable for the report. On the way out, the city man offered a generous sum in exchange for permission to reproduce the system. Eleanor refused. He said there was no system. There was only intention. The rumor spread. She refused money, opportunity, fame, madness, some said, pride, others said. Or maybe she just understands something that we don't understand, ventured one of the men who once tried to break down her door. A few days later, he returned, with head bowed, clean hands. I brought stones from the river, and he asked softly, "Can I leave it here? You don't even need to teach me. I just want them to be close." Eleanor nodded. He didn't smile. He only showed a corner of the backyard. Others followed. Gradually, the house ceased to be a shelter. It became a kind of silent altar, not because of religion, but because of the memory. No one else tried to copy the floor. They did, in fact, begin to take better care of themselves, to understand that what saved Caleb was not just the stone, it was the time dedicated to her. In the community, people began to speak Eleanor's name with more care. Those who had mocked her now stopped when they saw her pass by. There were no apologies, not even confessions, but there was respect. Silent, firm, and that was more than enough. Winter has passed, but the silence remains. When spring arrived, there was no party. The community was no longer the same, neither because of the losses, nor because of the survivors. The houses bore their marks, patched cracks, makeshift doors, disused stoves, but one, among them all, seemed intact. A for Eleanor, not because it hadn't suffered, but because it hadn't been built to withstand the cold, and yes, to giving up. Caleb went back to running in the yard, still thin, still silent, but with a steady gaze. From time to time he would sit on the ground and put his ear to the stone, as if he were listening to something that no one else could hear. Eleanor no longer received regular visits, but from time to time, someone would leave a clean stone on the edge of the wall. No one explained it, and she didn't ask. Some said it was gratitude. Others said it was superstition. Eleanor could only see through her memory. The engineer from the capital returned once. He brought with him a new project, a formal proposal. He claimed to have found investors. It had graphs, names, diagrams. She listened attentively. Then he served weak coffee, and in the same voice as always he said, "None of them were here when my son was coughing until he passed out. None of them lent me a shovel." He lowered his eyes. He left in silence. He never came back. A few years later, they started calling the place House of the Hot Ground. Tourists started visiting. Journalists were sending letters. A teacher from the capital wanted to write a book. Eleanor did not stop it, but he wasn't receiving it either. She continued tending to the stones. I washed some. He was resettling others, not out of thermal necessity, but out of respect. It was as if each one carried a piece of the fear she once had. And from the promise he made without words, "As long as I can, you will live." In the community, other women began to experiment, not for copying, but to understand, to create your own ways of caring. Eleanor's floor has never been replicated, because it wasn't formulaic. It was a witness, and gradually everyone understood. It wasn't about stones. It was an intention shaped by pain, and heat was urgently needed. Some legacies cannot be built with words, not even with signs. They settle in silence, stone by stone, until they become part of the ground that supports others. The cold of that mountain taught what time often forgets, that not all knowledge can be transmitted, because some knowledge cannot be taught. It must be lived. Eleanor's house is still there. No license plates, no fences, but those who pass by slow down, as if he could sense in the discreet warmth of the earth the echo of a mother who, one day, he didn't ask for help, nor for forgiveness. He just built it. If this story warmed your heart, leave a like now and subscribe, because here we don't deliver formulas, we deliver stories that stay with you.